How many of you here are husband and wife combinations? How many husband and wife combinations? Okay, yeah. It's nice to see you out here together tonight. It kind of reminds me of the husband and wife that were in the kitchen one day, and there was a big explosion. Threw them out right through the window and out in the middle of the backyard. Next door neighbor looked out the window and said, first time they've gone out together in 20 years. So good to see you all out together tonight. Okay, this panel of scholars, now we're going to show what they've been teaching and had been denying all along, and they publish it in this 3-set volume, Renewal of Church, and so on. And they repudiate the Bible's inspiration, infallibility, and authority. And I'd like to read you some documentation on that. T. Hassel Bowen wrote in the College of the Bible Quarterly, that's down in Lexington, way back in 1958. Now this is showing you what happened in the first half of the 20th century and how we got where we ended up. He said this: "We are reminded by realistic biblical scholars that revelation does not come to us through a miraculous revelation of abstract and propositional truths about God and the world, as though certain creedal propositions were let down perfect and complete from God to the finite order of existence." High flute language there. But then Ralph Wilburn, who was the dean of the College of the Bible in Lexington, says this in their publication: "The Bible certainly is indispensable, yet intellectual integrity demands that we no longer cling to a theory about the Bible which identifies it absolutely with the infallible Word of God." Then we come along again, Dean Wilburn writes in another article, in another issue of the College of the Bible, he says this. Now this is about the Scripture. "The impregnable rock of Scripture is not so impregnable anymore thanks to the science of biblical criticism." In the same article, he says this: "The infallible book of old Protestantism is gone forever for critical, thoughtful minds." And he says this in the same article: "In view of the conclusions reached by recent biblical criticism, theological integrity calls upon discipledom for a more forthright abandonment of this false belief in an infallible book." So that's the way these scholars now that have been educated in these other schools and accepted it have come back and are now teaching the preachers in our movement. This is what they're teaching in our colleges in the movement. They also repudiate the Bible's representation of Jesus. Let me give you some quotes here. William Baird, he was a professor of New Testament at the College of the Bible. See, the College of the Bible was the first of the schools. And as it went, the domino effect, then they all went one after another. And William Baird was a professor of New Testament at the College of the Bible, and here's what he says: "Since the rise of form criticism, however, serious questions have been raised as to what can be known about the life of Jesus. The Gospels are not historical records, but compilations of small units of oral tradition. Many of these units are of doubtful historicity, while their literary relationship is certainly the construction of later editors." In other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not the authors. "The quest for the historical Jesus, it seemed, led straight into a blind alley." Here's what the professors are teaching in the colleges, teaching the young preachers that are going out. And see, the Campbell Institute said, and we're trying to get these young preachers that are now hearing this to stay within the movement. Any church that will accept them, stay there, and we'll interpret our movement so that you'll find this feasible and plausible, and you can accept it. All right? Goes on over here on page Wilburn, the first man we referred to, says practically the same thing. He says this: "In short, the entire question as to whether the Bible or the teaching of Jesus can in any sense be regarded as an authority has become problematical. This belief in the old Orthodox sense is no longer possible." That's why I quote them. I don't say this is what they believe or this is what somebody's affirmed. This is what they say for themselves in their own publications. Then came along the practice of open membership. Now, open membership is the practice of receiving in a full membership in our churches those who are called the pious unimmersed. The people who have never been baptized, have been sprinkled as infants, so forth. That was what was called open membership. And let me read some quotes on that. Under the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, it now had, the passage of time, it had done a great work, but then it finally became liberal. And all the new missionaries that were sent out now were now missionaries that believed these things that they were teaching. No longer believed in the basic principles of the movement, these new missionaries. And one was in China by the name of George Baird. And George Baird wrote in a letter to C.C. Morrison, who was the editor of the Christian Century, which was a very liberal disciple publication. He wrote this: 8 years ago, in a paper read before our China convention, I proposed open membership. One of our secretaries, F.M. Raines, who was visiting China at the time — Raines was a member of the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, and he was still solid and conservative. F.M. Raines, who was visiting China at the time, requested me to resign and go home. I did not resign, and my convictions have grown stronger as the years have gone by. Now, Morrison read that letter in one of the conventions, in one of the international conventions, and also published that letter in the Christian Century. Then in 1919, Baird wrote Morrison again, and here's what he wrote this time. During the discussion at the China Convention, it was reported that in every station of the China Mission except one, members of other denominations, unimmersed, had been included in the annual report on membership. We have been actually practicing open membership in all our stations except one for several years. Then he continues in that same letter. They, the unimmersed members, are serving on our official boards. At present, we have a Methodist and a Presbyterian on our official board. These have been reported as members of the congregation. These men are considered regular members of our congregation. We have men serving as paid evangelists who have never been immersed. They are employed as regular pastors and evangelists in our churches. Well, when those revelations began to come out, they began to require then of these missionaries that they sign a letter of loyalty, that they would adhere to the basic principles, whether they believed them or not. They would. So many of them did sign these letters of loyalty. Well, Marguerite Harmon Brough was one of those who signed one of those letters. 27 years later, 1949, here she says in the Christian Century, C.C. Morrison, the editor, here's what she now says. We had our scrimmages on the mission field too, where some churches accepted Presbyterians and Congregationalists and other unimmersed brethren on a par with the immersed and let them serve as deacons, elders, and teachers. Now listen to this. However, we settled that difficulty by keeping the names off the official rolls sent to America for the yearbook. You saw deceit, duplicity, dishonesty right across the board. And C.C. Morrison writes something. When the liberals were denying this, they say, hey, no, this isn't happening at all. They were denying it. C.C. Morrison, even though he was liberal, was a very honest liberal. And R.E. Elmore, who was my predecessor as editor of the Restoration Herald, he and C.C. Morrison knew one another, were very good friends, though they were at opposite poles of their theology and beliefs and so forth. But here's what C.C. Morrison wrote in the Christian Century. The truth is that in recent years, the disciple official mind has become accustomed to playing fast and loose with its own convictions. The greatest danger in the present issue is not theological reaction, but moral disintegration. Neither conservatives nor liberals, so-called, can endure the spectacle of the United Christian Missionary Society continuing to assert what is not true and to deny what is true. He just scathingly denounced his own brethren for their duplicity in all their actions. They also rejected now these organizations, the United Christian Missionary Society, the Board of Publication, the International Convention, the colleges and so forth. They rejected the non-denominational status because they rejected it. It was linked to their ecumenical aspirations. Again, let's go back here to Ron Osborne. He gives perhaps the most candid and honest revelation of all. Going back to that address, the future of the disciples of Christ, International Convention, his keynote address, listen to what he says. It now seems clear that restorationism has been a misguided attempt at apostolicity in its assumption that every recorded practice of the ancient church, no matter how casual, constitute part of an ironclad pattern for all time. And then he goes on to say this in the same address. With regard to our own functioning as a Christian denomination, two areas of our life as disciples of Christ are of particular importance to the ecumenical future. These are brotherhood structure and theology. Same address, he goes on to say, it is wholesome that disciples are consciously working on a more rational, more integrated ecclesiastical structure. We do well to recognize it as such and to encourage every development whereby each congregation, through explicit statement in its constitution and bylaws, and through practical performance, affirms the principle of commitment to the brotherhood program and to the responsible structure of cooperation. Now, why does this have to be done? In this same address, I mean, he bears it all. He says this has to be done because only thus do we have any effective part in the ecumenical movement. Our membership in councils of churches is through our conventions, and our participation in their work is through our responsible agencies. Only thus is there any hope of our successful venture into a possible merger in the future and the losing of our life as disciples to find a larger life within a united church. Of course, the ecumenical church is what he's talking about. Now let me explain here what he's saying. You see, these federations, it began with the Federal Council of Churches, which became then a part of the National Council of Churches, which then became a part of the World Council of Churches. All these organizations are based upon denominations. And in the denominational structure of the church, when your headquarters or your official representatives spoke, they spoke for the entire denomination. You get that? That was authoritative. They represented every church within that denomination. Well, this was frustrating to the disciples because in the Restoration movement, every congregation was locally autonomous. No convention, no agency could represent us as a people, as a movement. Every congregation locally autonomous with its own elders, so forth. So it was frustrating them. They were attending these conclaves, but they couldn't speak for anybody but for themselves. So they said, well, we've got to do something about that. We've got to structure our movement, make it a actual denomination with a hierarchical structure and so forth, so that when we attend these gatherings, we can speak officially for the entire movement, for every congregation in the movement. That's exactly what this is all about from the very beginning. And he admits it here in this address in 1958. So they reject that status, okay? Notice he goes on to say here, ecclesiasticism is growing. The ecumenical movement is built on denominations. Union proceeds by denominational merger. Increasingly, disciples see themselves as a denomination and seek a more rational and effective ecclesiastical institution through the efforts toward restructure. We'll come to the restructure next week when we get into our discussion. And the court suits and everything else that came in that those several terrible decades. Now, and the thing that led to the court trials and so forth is this next thing, number 6. They elevated human expedience to the level of basic faith and doctrine. In other words, here's the contention. The support of our agency life, the support of our conventions determines whether or not you are a Church of Christ or a Christian church. If you do not support our agency life, our conventions, you are no longer a Church of Christ or Christian church, and you have to forfeit title to your property. And we'll get into that, as I say, next week. So they took what was an expediency and they turned it into a level of faith and made it a test of fellowship. And isn't it sad? They took things that were doctrine and turned them into matters of opinion. As long as you supported the agency life, it didn't make any difference what you believed. You could believe anything from the fact that Jesus was the Holy Spirit conceived, virgin-born Son of the living God, or you could believe that he was the illegitimate child of a Roman occupation soldier and still be a member of the Church of Christ or Christian Church. So they turn matters of faith into opinion and matters of opinion into matters of faith. And next week will be an interesting week. You'll want to look forward to it, okay? So now comes the orientation of the churches. Here, the clergy had swallowed hook, line, and sinker liberalism. They'd infiltrated and got hold of our agency life. They infiltrated and they got hold of our great educational institutions. And so now the issue was, how are we going to educate our poor, ignorant churches who don't know any better than to believe the old paths and the ancient order of things and biblical Christianity? Like you remember I said last week, Dr. Jack Suggs, head of the New Testament department, Bright Divinity School, Texas Christian University. The idea of restoring the church as the New Testament, it's unbiblical, it's unhistorical, it's unscholarly, and it's nonsensical. So this is what they said. Now we've got to educate our churches. We've got to get them up to where we are. How are they going to do it? All right, let's look at it. The Division of Education of the Disciples of Christ and materials prepared by its curriculum committee in 1945, through Bethany Press and Christian Board of Publication, began to send out materials for all the women's missionary organizations, for all the youth groups, for all the Bible school curriculum in all of our churches across America. This is what they were doing. So they were going to begin educating us in this new knowledge in liberal theology. Now let me give you some samples of that. Bethany Press of Christian Board of Publication had a man by the name of Leslie R. Smith, who was an open practitioner of open membership and the first open membership president of the International Convention of Churches of Christ. They had him write a quarterly in their Bible school material called Understanding Jesus. And in his lesson material that was sent out through their publication for all the Bible school teachers and so forth, he referred all the teachers to a book written by W.B. Denny, and the name of that book was The Career and Significance of Jesus. Now, if all the Bible school teachers took Leslie Smith's advice and they got that book so they could teach about the career and significance of Jesus, here's what they found out about the New Testament theories of the divinity of Jesus. Quote, some of them, perhaps all of them, we have clearly outgrown. Of the resurrection, he says this, he tells our Bible school teachers, many people today feel that these stories are to be taken much as the wonder stories of the birth are taken, as stories that grew out of the devout imagination and the desire to make real and vivid the truth of Jesus' invisible presence among his followers. Then he asks this question concerning Jesus. Can we say reasonably that a man, that's Jesus, thus limited historically and geographically, physically and mentally, can be permanently supreme in his significance for religion? See what they do to Jesus? Well, the young people become targets. They prepare material. They don't overlook any aspect of the local church. They're going to re-educate them. So now they prepare all the material for all the youth groups in the churches. And so Mary Lyman in the Christian Youth Fellowship, entitled Jesus, tells our young people this. Truly it is hard to tell when fiction ends and truth begins, and many of these stories are the beginning of the world. But here now was what she tells the young people about Jesus. Listen. We should face at the outset the necessity of acknowledging the limitations of Jesus' knowledge. A child today has more information about the physical world in which we live than Jesus could have had. The beginner in scientific study to today is possessed of facts about the nature of our universe about which Jesus never dreamed. Think of that. So you take what Mary Lyman says, or you take what the Apostle John says in the prologue to his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that hath been made. You can take Mary Lyman, or you can take what the Hebrew writer says in the prologue, God having of old time spoken to the fathers and the prophets by divers portions and in divers manners, hath at the end of these days spoken unto us in His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He made the worlds. But she's telling our young people why a child today, a beginner in scientific education, knows more about our universe than Jesus could have ever had or could have ever dreamed of. So this is what they're doing now, you see, all along here. So that's our young people. Now, let's see. Let's come along and see what they do to our mission groups. What the ladies get in the missionary societies in the churches. There's a lady by the name of Jessie Trout. She was a missionary to Japan. And Jessie Trout wrote an article and she sent it back to the United Christian Missionaries. They were impressed by it. They were so impressed by the article that she wrote that they had it printed up and they sent it out to every women's Christian missionary society in our churches. Well, this is what she wrote. One of the chief criticisms leveled at foreign missions by scholarly critics is that missions tear down the religions and beliefs of the people whom the missionaries have come to serve. Fortunately, many modern missionaries have learned to recognize the value in the religions of the East. They no longer approach their problems from a superior than thou standpoint, but with open minds and hearts they say, let us work on the good foundation which you've laid, and together build a religion that will be perfect and complete. Now, concerning Confucianism and Buddhism, she continues in this article. Surely the founders of these religions, that's Confucianism and Buddhism, have been witnesses of the living God. Christianity today can just as surely find common truths in the teachings of Oriental prophets. She goes on to say, I have thought that if the transfiguration were to take place in the Orient, we would find Jesus on the Mount in conversation with the Buddha and Confucius. Because modern missions believe this, Christianity can and does join hands with the non-Christian religions. So rather than Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration, she would have Buddha and Confucius. Now you say, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. Surely they didn't tolerate that. Is that acceptable? Well, the Cincinnati newspapers, when the International Convention was held here in Cincinnati, Ohio, not here, down in Cincinnati, Ohio, when it was held down there, it was in 1949 when that convention was held. I was in Cincinnati at the time. The headlines of the Cincinnati newspapers came out with this, quote, and I quote the headline, Miss Jessie F. Trout, Indianapolis, was elected Vice President of the United Christian Missionary Society yesterday at the Assembly of the International Convention of the Disciples of Christ. Get this. The boast to which Miss Trout was elected is one of the highest in the disciple brotherhood. So that's how she was rewarded for this type of infidelity that she had been spreading, so forth. And later on, of course, she became the executive secretary of the Disciples Christian Women Missionary Society at the same time. So, let's see. I'm going to stop there with that. I could read on and on and on and on and on. This doesn't, by the way, this doesn't even touch the hem of the garment, the things I've been reading tonight. But they're typical of what is being taught in our institutions of higher education among the disciples, that is. What has happened as a result? Well, a new denomination was formed, of course. This came, and I'll be dealing with this a little later on. And at the time, after the court trials and after restructuring and so forth, we lost about 5,000 congregations in our movement. At the time, there were around 10,000, 11,000 churches in our movement here in this country. We lost about 5,000. Why? Because this kind of material was going into the churches, and also the elders of these churches were accepting these legal documents that the society was sending to them to sign, to tie them into the organization. And that's how we lost 5,000 churches. And I've said this. When you have shepherds who do not recognize wolves in sheep's clothing, that flock is in great trouble. And they didn't. Why in the world does a wolf put on sheep's clothing? Yeah, disguise itself and to deceive the flock. And that's exactly what was happening here. And these men who were elders in the church, shepherds of the flock, did not recognize these wolves in sheep's clothing. And so we lost 5,000 congregations. Since that time, since 1968, the disciples now number less than 3,500 congregations. They're a dying denomination. And by the way, this problem which I'm citing to you tonight, which reared its ugly head in our midst, wasn't unique to us. It had, before it had hit us, hit almost every denomination in America. And that's the reason you find mainline denominations today are declining tremendously in membership. Because they've gone liberal, they've all believed this, and they're now advocating, they're rewriting their creed, they're rewriting the Westminster Confession of Faith and these other creeds to allow ordaining of practicing homosexuals, allowing and sanctioning same-sex marriage, and people are defecting by the thousands from all these mainline denominations. We are living in what has been accurately described, I think, the post-denominational age. And I say, this is prime time for us to share unashamedly and in love the restoration plea and the principles of the restoration movement, because it's becoming increasingly attractive. People do not want denominational names. They do not want to be part of a hierarchy and organization. And the fact that Christ is the only creed, the Bible is the only rule book, they're simply willing to be called Christians, that's attractive increasingly. Out at where I am at Bright Christian Church, the last 4 years, we have over 200 editions every year. It's exploding. And most of those people are coming from every diverse type of denomination you could conceive of. In fact, we've been baptizing more Roman Catholics perhaps than anybody else. Because people are searching, they're looking, they're hungry, and when they hear this, they say, that's what we're looking for. That's what we want. It's a great plea, nothing to be ashamed of. You don't have to apologize for it. You just simply take people to the Word, let the Holy Spirit do His work. He'll do a better job than you and I can do. And I'm excited about the plea. We'll talk about that in the fourth week when we come to that, what's going on today in our movement. So we lost 33 churches of schools of higher education. The first one was the College of the Bible. As soon as J.W. McGarvey, a great conservative Bible scholar, as soon as he was gone, the trustees made their move. Well, he was highly respected. They didn't do it while he was still there. But moved, they sent Fortune and Foster to Yale and Harvard. That was the beginning. And it went, Bethany College, established by Alexander Campbell. My mother is an alumna of Bethany College. I was telling you a while ago, the only time I ever saw my mother cry was when I was about a 15-year-old boy. And on vacation, my mother and father took us to Bethany College. Great historic place. And when she stood in the hall of the administration building and looked at the pictures of all those great men of faith that had helped start that school and been men of great faith, she wept because her alma mater had departed from the faith. My father was a graduate of Hiram College, the same college that President Garfield. Did you know President Garfield was a Christian minister? Same college that he graduated from. B.D. Phillips graduated from Hiram College. Now it's a cesspool of infidelity. We lost Indianapolis, Indiana, the Butler School of Religion, Butler University. That was one of our colleges. Now it's known as Christian Theological Seminary, one of the most rabid liberal theological seminaries in America. In fact, they're turning out more liberal denominational preachers than they are turning out disciple Christ preachers. Drake Divinity School, Drake University, Des Moines, Iowa. In fact, it's closed now. The Divinity School is gone out of business. Phillips University, Enid, Oklahoma, closed its doors. Eureka College, Illinois, where President Reagan, by the way, graduated. You know, he was originally a member of the Christian church. Graduated Eureka College, gone. Texas Christian, as I said, gone. 33 schools we lost within the first 4 decades of the 20th century. how rapidly it can happen. And I'm concerned today, the same thing. The farther you get away from those who founded an institution, first generation, they're on fire. They've got a sense of mission. They've got a vision, enthusiastic. Second generation, sat under the feet of those men, same. Third generation, still, but fourth generation. And you get men in your board of trustees, you get men in your faculty who are not familiar with the purposes, the principles that were behind the establishment of that institution, the farther you get away. And what's happening in our colleges today, it's not universally true, but it's too true. Our Bible colleges used to be taught by men who were preachers. Many of them who had gone and got further education, conservative, but they were preachers. They preached for churches that had ministries. Today, the process is you go from Bible college, away to these graduate schools, get your advanced degrees, you come right back into the Bible college and teach. And in some places, we're finding more and more this influence is coming on. So that's the thing that we'll concern ourselves with. So all of these schools we lost. What was the reaction of the churches? Well, the reaction, of course, as people began to get the information, began to learn, they quit sending support to these colleges. They quit sending support to the Non-Christian Missionary Society. They stopped attending the International Convention. And when this began, then more and more pressure became on us. My father was preaching the largest church in his ministry. I grew up as a boy in Buffalo, New York. 8 years, my growing up time was there. And when I grew up in Buffalo, New York, there were 33 churches of Christ in what was referred to as the Niagara Frontier. When we left in 1936, there were 33 churches of the Niagara Frontier. I went back up in that area to hold some revival meetings in 1946. There were only 11 churches left. In that short period of time, the liberalism of the disciples had come in and just absolutely ravished those churches. My father finally ended up moving, and he got down to church at First Christian Church, Parkersburg, West Virginia, one of the largest Christian churches in West Virginia. When my dad went there, they were averaging around 250. My dad's ministry only lasted 2.5 years. I'll tell you why. When he left 2.5 years later, they were averaging about 500. They'd had 250 additions in that period of time. When we went there, the young people were attending the Christian Youth Conference at Bethany College. Parkersburg wasn't too far from Bethany, Wellsburg, West Virginia. When they young people came back, they reported to the elders that they had been taught by professors at that college and by preachers of that area that there was no such place as a literal heaven and hell. Jesus was not the virgin-born Son of God. He was the bastard son of a Roman occupation soldier. The Bible was not the infallible Word of God. So what happened, the elders, primarily under the influence of my father, next year sent our youth group over here to Franklin, Ohio, which is just south of Dayton, there, the old Methodist Chautauqua meeting grounds, Tri-State Christian Service. It was one of, at that day, it was one of 25 Christian service camps we had in the country. We had to travel almost 250 miles to get to the nearest Christian service camp. And you had to be 14 years of age before you went. So I wasn't eligible the first year. I had to wait until our second year. I was in Parkersburg before I could come. And you only had 1 week. We didn't have first chance camps and junior camps and day camps and all. We had 1 week. Everybody from 14 years of age on up to college age went. And Roman, the Tri-State over there, probably ran. Maybe some of you may have attended that camp. It went on up to Hocking Valley near Chillicothe. Then it joined Butler Springs down here. That's the history of the old Tri-State camp. Anyway, went to that, came back. Well, the chairman of the board was one of the most influential businessmen in town. He was a deacon. He was in the pocket of the Disciples organization. When they heard that the youth group had gone to this independent camp, is what they branded them, and so forth, instead of the state college conference in Bethany, that got the state secretary involved, and he and this chairman of the board began to work. And they were incensed over the fact that not only had we sent our young people there instead of Bethany, but also that my father had been guilty of the terrible sin of sending his daughter to the Cincinnati Bible Seminary instead of to Bethany College, the State Disciples College. So that's when it began, putting pressure on my dad. And finally, it got so intense, and most of the elders were begotten to this businessman who gave them his business, so forth. So their livelihood was a lot dependent on him, knuckled under, and so finally my dad was compelled to resign. His letter of resignation was read, and the chairman of the elders stood up and he began to say, I can still see it, I was just a high school kid, and with a long face, he said so sad, he said, it's a shame, but he said, Brother Bream has found out that there's greener grass on the other side of the fence, there are greener pastures elsewhere, and we're going to accept this resignation with regret. Before he got the words out of his mouth, the chairman of the deacons, great big old burly railroad engineer, came walking down the aisle. I'll never forget it. He took that letter of resignation out of the grasp of the chairman of that elders. He said, there's no way we will accept this resignation. He said, we've had 250 additions. Our attendance has doubled in the last 2.5 years. He said, there's no way. The grass is just still as green as it's ever been on this side of the fence. Say that we take a vote to deny. Every person, and 500 were in attendance that Sunday, everybody stood up to reject that resignation except 12 people. But they were the moneyed people. They were the movers and shakers in that congregation. And my dad said to have stayed would have been a bloody, bloody episode. So he resigned and left. Well, several months after he left, about 150 people in that church left too and started another church. But that's what began to happen all across America. When you no longer supported the organized life, then they began to come threats. And so that led us into then the court cases, which we're going to get into next week. So I think, unless there's some questions, any questions or observations right now, we'll have about 5-7 minutes left before we break up, or maybe, no, about 10 minutes.
I can remember in Buford, we voted to get out of the Disciples book or something. They published the book and they said everybody that's in the book is a member of the Disciples and yes, we voted. I can remember that.
And that's what they dragged out in every court case without exception. They dragged out their yearbook, said, here, this church is listed in our yearbook, and here, years by, you can find out where they used to send money to us, so forth. And here you can find out where we gave them a loan from our Board of Church Extension, so they're one of our churches. And because they're refusing to support us now, they forfeit their title to their property. So that's what began. I do not want to get into too much detail on that particular aspect, anything about the material we've covered so far tonight. Admittedly, this is not one of the happiest lectures I deliver. In fact, it's probably one of the saddest episodes that I can rehearse to you. But it's a part of history. And the fact is, if people do not learn the lessons of history, they're doomed to repeat its mistakes. And we're already 50 years past that episode. And have we learned our lesson? We'll deal with that next week and the following week.